Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Humanities, SOH, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, English, MEG06 American Literature, Block 1 Contexts of American Literature, Unit-5 From the Colonial to the Federal, The Contexts of the American Enlightenment, 5.0 Objectives. The aim of this unit is to take stock of the contexts of American literature produced between the period of the early European colonial settlements in America and the formation of a federal association of these colonies in the wake of their struggle to achieve independence from the domination of the government in England. This period is often referred to as the period of the American Enlightenment. Taking off from the Enlightenment in England in terms of its ideas and ideals. Some of these ideas and ideals, as well as their exponents, are presented in the unit. The unit intends to offset the optimism of the Enlightenment ideology in general by focusing upon certain darker aspects of the Enlightenment period. 5.1 Introduction. The material basis of the American Enlightenment by the early 1700s to distinct economic worlds had taken shape in the colonies, generally north and south of Pennsylvania's southern border. One exported two crops, rice and tobacco, to Europe, and was in the process of constructing all its ways of living and thinking around a unique institution, chattel slavery. The other consisted overwhelmingly of not the big planters such as those who owned the tobacco and rice plantations, but of small farmers free of feudal obligations to anyone superior to them. These two societies were unlike anything in the British Isles or in Europe as a whole. The distinction between the southern and the northern colonies gradually began to be erased with the expansion of agricultural activities in the north to the extent that the colonies there started exporting their produce, contrary to their earlier practice, to the colonies in the south and beyond, to the West Indies. To facilitate this emerging commerce, by the 1720s a common paper currency was floated, bringing with it prospects of profit and riches. Soon, the Placid colonies were living through a boom period. At the hub of this boom was the new-look colonial city, no longer an extension of the countryside that it once used to be. Immigrants were beginning to pour in from Germany and Ireland in the 1720s, and thousands of slaves were being purchased in the South. A high rate of survival among American-born white children, who were reared in far healthier surroundings than children in Europe. 8 live children in a family, as against 4 in Europe, was common, accelerated the rise of population, as did a relatively low death rate. In 1700 there had been approximately 250,000 people in the colonies. By 1775 there would be about 2,250,000 and 5,300,000 by 1800, including people belonging to the indigenous tribes. A modern, multicultural America was in the making. Transatlantic trade flourished, and settlement slowly but surely stretched beyond the limited coastal beachlands of the 17th century into the fertile back country, soon reaching the Appalachian Mountains and entering their long interior valleys. With mounting affluence and influence, people, books and ideas moved back and forth across the Atlantic in rising volume. 5. To the Enlightenment in America. One of the many fascinating imports flowing into America from Europe after 1700 was a new way of thinking about God, nature, and humanity. The Enlightenment, founded in the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and especially in the work of towering English thinkers like the physicist Isaac Newton, 1642–1727, Enlightenment thought was consciously scientific, rational and this worldly. As such, Enlightenment thinking became for a small minority of educated Americans a critique as well as a counter to classic, traditional Protestantism. Henceforth, these two ways of thinking would intermingle in the American mind, producing a curious and contradictory blend of theistic belief and skeptical humanism. The new learning arrived with a dramatic suddenness in 1714. When Yale received a gift of books on Newtonian physics and Lockean philosophy, Newton simply wiped away the traditional view of the universe, brilliantly demonstrating how a few laws of physics could explain the motions of all heavenly bodies. The marvelous order and harmony, he believed, was the dearest possible demonstration of God's existence and authenticity, and of his real intentions for humans as well as natural life. Educated people who read Newton no longer saw the universe as controlled by an infinite number of spirits, each with its own planet, star, or comet to supervise. The sky seemed swept clean. All was geometry, calculation, and predictability. The universe was not a space of mysteries and uncertainties. It was, above all, a reasonable universe. John Locke applied this way of thinking so pervasively in political and social and human affairs that he became the preeminent philosophical influence in the 18th century thought, especially in America. He was fascinated by the power of reason, though he did not think it all-powerful. A moderate man in everything, he held that some things could never be explained by humanity's reasoning powers, that there were limits to what we could know on our own. About God, for example, he said we could know little, other than that he is the author of the universe and a pervasive influence in human life. People therefore need the Bible, Locke said. For only in revelation from God could they learn essential truths about the divine that reason, unaided, could never reveal. However, he believed true Christianity consisted of only a few essentials, and therefore he not only urged but exemplified a wide tolerance of all Protestant beliefs. An archetypal product of the American Enlightenment was the figure of Benjamin Franklin, 1706-1790. Franklin represented the essence of the Enlightenment in his celebration of rationality, practical conduct and materialism. A self-made man and a man of science, Franklin characteristically expressed a preference for what his contemporaries called natural religion or deism. If natural laws govern everything, people such as Franklin asked, wasn't nature itself God's truest Bible? The reasonable method in religion, therefore, according to them, called for a simple procedure: discover what things all people, that is, all civilized people, believe in wherever they are. By this means, true religion could be found. This came down to a belief in a supreme deity, God, in a code of ethics divinely established, which tells us how to live, and a belief that there is an afterlife in which people will receive their rewards and punishments for their deeds in this world. Church, rituals and miracles were simply local superstitions and wholly unnecessary. Some people were not ready to go so far. They believed that Christ, the ultimate miracle, was an expression, in some inexplicable way, of God's desires in this world, but they rejected the concept of the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost as not only mathematically paradoxical, but also contrary to natural law. Christ was a man, perhaps a divinely inspired one, but not God himself. There was only one God, they said. Thus, these people were called Unitarians. The Bible remained important to them as a book of divine teachings about how we should live be with each other. Unitarians believed each person must rely upon his or her own reasoning powers, keeping in mind that there was little that could be certain in religious matters. They believed that the individual is fundamentally good, and that if all persons listened to the voice of conscience, they would be listening to the voice of God. Unitarianism circulated as a kind of underground faith in England in the mid-18th century, prominent among scientists and intellectuals. It came to America in the century's late years. Most of America's founding fathers, including Franklin, would have called themselves Unitarians. Another notable figure of the American Enlightenment was St. Jean de Crèvecoeur, 1735–1813. A friend of Benjamin Franklin and a truly Franklinian character, this one French-born emigre used his classic Letters from an American Farmer, 1782, to celebrate the enlightened practice of democracy in America. The Franklinian aspect of Crèvecoeur's work is most readily apparent in the American Farmer's enthusiastic approbation of the values of individualism and industriousness, which formed the basis of the existence of a freeholder such as himself. It is the freeholder, no doubt, who is for Crèvecoeur the American, this new man about whom he seeks information, though his famous query, "What then is the American?" Indeed, the first 8 of Crèvecoeur's 12 letters are devoted to answering this question. The American, Crèvecoeur says, is a European or the descendant of an European who, leaving behind all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. In the great American asylum, the poor immigrant is freed from the oppression of a feudal society, from the taxation of landlord, church and monarch, from involuntary idleness, servile dependence, penury and useless labor. Here religion demands but little of him, and little voluntary service to the minister and gratitude to God. Can he refuse these? Be he a trader, farmer, craftsman or common laborer, he will be rewarded amply for his labor, so that in time he will cast off his servile timidity and acquire the dignity and self-confidence of a true human being. No wonder Crèvecoeur should exclaim, "We have no princes, for whom we toil, starve and bleed. We are the most perfect society now existing in the world." But if in the projection of the perfection of American society in his first 8 letters, Crèvecoeur echoes Franklin, in the last 4 letters he clearly signals the limits of the Franklinian discourse. It is in the 9th letter itself that we find Crèvecoeur striking the first disturbed notes of a contrary and contradictory theme. The occasion is provided by his visit to Charleston and his witnessing of the facts of Negro slavery as it is practiced in the South. The question that he now asks is not, "What then is the American, this new man?" but "What then is man, this being who boasts so much of the excellence and dignity of his nature among that variety of unscrutable mysteries, of unsolvable problems with which he is surrounded?" The line of inquiry leads him on to other trajectories of investigation and observation. What does the history of the earth show us but crimes of the most heinous nature, committed from one end of the world to the other? We observe avarice, rapine, and murder equally prevailing in all parts. The evil in human nature rivals the perversity of physical nature, which manifests itself arbitrarily in famine, diseases, elementary convulsions and dissensions, to such an extent that one would almost believe the principles of action in man, considered as the first agent of this planet, to be poisoned in their most essential parts. Crèvecoeur's admission of the insufficiency of reason as a guide in human affairs represents another strain of Enlightenment thought, the obverse of that articulated by Franklin. In Europe as well as in America, many people, especially clergymen, reacted aggressively to the ideologies of rationality and materialism and sought to re-establish the idea of a religion based on spirituality and emotionalism. Natural, religion, such critics said, gave people the sin of pride. They exalted their worldly powers and forgot their human weaknesses. Full devotion to Christ must be expressed every hour of every day. Christ must fill and permeate one's being. Preaching these ideas, John Wesley and George Whitefield, two Anglican priests, led a religious revival that swept England in the late 1730s. Enormous crowds in the fields listened enraptured. Storms of released feelings struck multitudes, as Whitefield, an especially dynamic preacher, warned of terrible sufferings that lay ahead for the unbelieving and held out salvation to all who truly believed in Christ. There was great excitement when the famous Whitefield arrived in America in 1739. He was greeted by enormous crowds from one end of the colonies to the other. Everywhere he preached vital religion against natural religion. So fantastic was the response that he was called the wonder of the age. Emulated by many American preachers, he thus helped to launch the revival frenzy that swept the colonial world in the years 1739 to 1744. The Great Awakening. As the revival progressed, all colonials awaited New England's reaction, for that region had long been recognized as America's foremost plantation of religion. It was the emergence of Jonathan Edwards, 1703-1748, at Northampton, Massachusetts, in 1734 and 1735 that seemed to many to be the real beginning of the American revival. In New England, where there was much anxiety about rising affluence, individualism, and the breakup of old ways, the underlying tension exploded with especial violence. Enthusiasm achieved unmatched heights, reaching near delirium in its early stages. Edwards utilized this enthusiasm and recast Calvinism to align with revivalism, thus becoming the most important Puritan theologian since John Calvin himself. The joy of the Great Awakening, he said, was good and proper. It was a delight that rushed in on people as their entire beings reacted to the love of God and to the beauties He had created in this world. But Edwards was a true Calvinist. God, in his mind, was still the blazing awesome, all-powerful, and holy majestic being who willed all things and was the center of faith. Considering the perfection of God, Edwards said, people could see in contrast how prideful, lustful, and selfish they were in their self-centered, petty lives. Consider the universe that God had made, how harmonious and perfect it was. Consider the beauties of the natural creation, of all that was of God. Astonished and overwhelmed by all this, people would be drawn to God, as in nature all things were drawn by gravitation to a common center. Left to ourselves, he said, we are bound for hell. Such a fate was appropriate for creatures so corrupted and tarnished. This made God's salvation all the more ravishing to consider. Salvation, for Edwards, meant living not only a moral life, but also a life in which people worked for the regeneration of all society, in its institutions and arrangements as well as in its religion. Working across the boundaries of religious sects with others similarly regenerated in other churches, the new elect would transform the world. There had thus appeared once more, in the Great Awakening, the powerful motivations that had impelled the 17th century Puritans, the first radicals. 5.3 Slavery and the Enlightenment. For all its celebration of reason, the American Enlightenment witnessed the large-scale expansion of the irrational institution of slavery. As the economy enlarged, Southern planters joined whites in the Caribbean islands and Latin America in calling for more slaves from Africa. And by 1700 a new crop was making its appearance. About 1685 it had been discovered that the flat coastal lowlands of South Carolina were ideal for raising the ancient grain brought from the Orient to the Occident in the Middle Ages, rice. Slaves taken to the region around Charleston were put to work in large gangs on extensive rice plantations. The harsh climate in the swamps and wetlands, and the region's endemic tropical diseases brought horrifying death rates to the slave populations. However, high profits allowed the small white population to live in safety and luxury in Charleston, and when the colony of Georgia was founded in 1732 in Savannah. Directing their plantations from a distance, i.e. they did not live in the presence of their slaves and come to know them as individual persons, they regarded the cost of replacing those who had died as simply an unavoidable cost of operation. The rice plantations sent 18 million pounds of their crop to Europe in 1730. By 1770, exports had reached the huge total of 76 million pounds, and the price had even risen 10%. Thus, black slaves, despite their high death rate, continued to be highly profitable. By 1750 they constituted 60% of the Carolina population. In 1775, South Carolina alone held 100,000 slaves. The other great region in the South lay around the Chesapeake Bay. Here the economy was built around the tobacco plant, which was raised most efficiently on small farms. Due to overproduction, tobacco prices remained fairly low, keeping profits down. Thus, Virginia planters could not generally afford slave gangs. They tended, in fact, to buy more black women from Africa than did rice planters, in order to acquire cheaply, through later childbearing, the slaves it was hard for them to acquire directly. This in turn allowed for a healthier and more vigorous family life among Chesapeake Bay slaves, who in any event were freer of sickness because they did not work in disease-ridden swamps and in large gangs where contagious diseases spread rapidly. The Virginia slaves therefore flourished through natural increase in a fashion strikingly different from the situation further south, and especially from that in the cruel Caribbean island sugar plantations. There were over 170,000 slaves in Virginia in 1775, who amounted to almost half of the colony's population. Desperate to increase their profits, slave owners extracted work from their slaves with utter ruthlessness. Idleness was not tolerated, indeed severely punished. Beatings became harsh and savage. Fugitive slaves could even be freely, legally killed for their crime. Also, slave owners evolved an elaborate code of laws, practices, and attitudes to rationalize their brutal treatment of the slaves and make slavery appear right and proper and indeed a duty in the 18th century. Of course, this was a situation not limited to the South. From Pennsylvania northward there were scattered concentrations of black slave populations, particularly in towns and cities. New York had the highest proportion, with perhaps 15% of its population black. New Jersey and Pennsylvania contained 8%, and in New England as a whole the figure was 3%. In general, by the 1790s, a higher proportion of the whole population was black than at any point ever again in American history, some 20%. With black people growing in numbers far more rapidly than whites, there was great fear of slave rebellions, which in fact began taking place on a small scale as early as 1663 in Virginia. This led to the creation of stringent, often savage, slave codes in all the colonies. These codes were built on two concepts: absolute authority of slave owners over slaves, and the belief that blacks were of barbarous, wild, savage natures and wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices that applied to whites. New York, with its many slaves, had a tough regimen of slave codes. In South Carolina, where by 1765 there were 2 blacks to every white person, regular slave patrols gave the countryside a military character, rivaling the specter of slave revolt. As a source of tension in the South was the obvious and widespread mingling of the races, particularly where blacks were most numerous and under the strictest, most dehumanizing controls. One of the great paradoxes in race relations is that the heaviest intermingling occurred precisely when black Americans were the least free, not after the ending of slavery. Nothing aroused such powerful anger in white men as the thought of black slaves forcing themselves on white women, a common and obsessive fear. Despite disapprovals and disallowances from London, Southern states often used castration, sometimes in an astonishingly routine way, as a punishment or as a taming tactic for black men. Few things so aided the rise of English contempt for Americans, indeed, Northern contempt for Southerners, as the manner in which slaves were treated from Chesapeake southward. 5.4 The American woman of the 18th century, the irrationality of blatant race oppression was matched by the irrationality of subtle gender discrimination in 18th century America. The codes of gender discrimination, in fact, were inbuilt into the structure of the colonial American family. The form of family which the colonials brought with them from Britain was much like that familiar to modern Americans, nuclear family, in which husband and wife and their children formed a household. Land was generally granted to the head of the household, the father. As the generations passed and the original tight village communities of the early colonial phase broke apart, families tended to live in separate, isolated homesteads. By the 1750s, intermarriage between households in thousands of small towns and villages in the northern colonies had built a strong network of relationships which helped to make community life stronger than it had been. Nonetheless, nuclear families remained the basic social units in colonial life. Within the family, the need to be almost entirely self-sufficient made for a close interdependence between husbands and wives. There was no question which of the two was legally and morally superior. Male supremacy was the rule, which is not the same as saying it was a law of nature. This was expressed most dramatically in the possession of land by men, not by women, unless they became widowed, since land was the economic basis of almost all life. Women and men usually worked separately, the one in the house and the kitchen, garden, the other in the fields and with the livestock, but the two activities flowed into a single economic unit. Broadly, men's work centered around farming while women's work centered around manufacturing. Women preserved the vegetables and salted the meats, brewed the beer and pressed the cider. In addition, they wove cloth, made wool and sewed dresses. They also dipped candles and cared for family health by preparing home remedies and soap. Preparing meals was but the last stage in the manufacturing process, and this was done in addition to the routine tasks of bearing and rearing children. Nonetheless, wives were considered inferior to their husbands, whom they were to obey reverently. Colonials thought of the home as a little commonwealth, in which man's authority provided government and administration, even if he were himself unruly. Everyone, in fact, was thought to occupy a certain position on the social hierarchy. All of life was thought to be arranged within the great chain of being, and subjection to men was woman's role. On the other hand, Puritans and Quakers seemed determined to treat women as persons of substance and significance. Men were lectured endlessly not to be dictatorial, and women were instigated not to be dictated to. Colonial courts often moved in to protect women and children from brutal maltreatment of men. Marriage was made a contract that could be broken, not a permanent, divine state as under Catholicism. And, of course, the woman's crucial role in the household, which had to be self-sufficient in a world where 90% of the people lived on the farm, gave Adam's rib a strong position. In addition, both Quaker and Puritan teachings made conjugal love between married people a tender and lofty part of life. Couples were endlessly entreated to express their affection, to regard each other as one flesh and spirit, and thus to avoid the civil war that might tragically mar such little commonwealths. In short, there was a distinctly modern quality in colonial American marriage. 5.5 Summary. In this unit, I have tried to describe the evolution of colonial America into a federal structure in the process of engaging with modern economic and cultural influences, the period during which this transition occurred, anticipating America's emergence as a nation-state in its own right, is popularly referred to as the period of the American Enlightenment. This unit focuses on some major Enlightenment personages as well as on their points of view. Simultaneously, an attempt is made to explore the other side of Enlightenment euphoria, exploitation on the basis of race and gender in particular, which made the progress of the Enlightenment period possible. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.